You're listening to Arsenal Pass, a flesh and blood podcast for players by players. And all about strategy, leveling up, and the latest news in the world of Wraith. Welcome to Arsenal Pass.
Hello everyone, welcome back to episode 190 of Arsenal Pass. Hayden Dale here with Pankaj Bhojwani. This week on the pod, we're talking FAB Math. For some time now, Math, or FAB Math as it's now shorthanded to, I guess, instead of Flesh and Blood Math, or Math and Flesh and Blood, has been, I would say, at the forefront of deck building. Successful decks, limited strategy, and beyond. And FAB Math really rose to prominence, I would say, during the Bullander era, Pankaj. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's when this discourse really started. It started with, Michael Hamilton sort of revolutionizing a little bit about the way we look at cards and the value of cards.
I feel like, though, the conversation has maybe softened in recent times. I don't know if people have just accepted it's just part of Flesh and Blood, or have we just moved on from that era, but I know that is exactly what you want to talk about in the main topic of the pod, so I won't spoil that. I'm looking forward to it. First of all, though, Thanksgiving week, last weekend. Thanksgiving was last Thursday, right? So how was your Thanksgiving week? What's been happening? What have you been up to? It's kind of, being in this side of, or this, half of the globe, we don't really have a holiday pre-Christmas, so it's all kind of like summer starts, but it's very work-orientated or school-orientated, until you get into mid-December. So I don't know, what's it like? What's it been like the last week or so?
It was really, really fun. Got, a bit of an extended break, like a super long weekend, like Thursday and Friday. And my workplace, at least my organization, like my team, we had a coordinated day off on Wednesday as well. So I had like a super long weekend. Very good. Very light Flesh and Blood wise, except for actually, I did a Friendsgiving. That's what we call, for people who don't come back home to their families on Thanksgiving, they just celebrate with their friends. I did Friendsgiving with a bunch of FAB locals, actually, which is really, really nice.
Oh, nice.
Something I've always wanted to do is hang out with, my Flesh and Blood friends outside of just armories and outside of just like Flesh and Blood. So it was really nice to get to be able to do that. We had a little dinner at a friend's place. It was really good. So in the FAB wise, it's been a little more chill. But recently, at least closer to this week, been trying to get in touch with the Living Legend format because I will be casting Calling Chicago next weekend. So
cool.
Yeah, so I have to make sure I know what's going on there. How's your week been? So you don't really celebrate Thanksgiving down there, do you?
Not at all. No, well, actually, I have a few North American friends, so, sometimes we'll do something, depending if someone's organized, like you say, like a Friendsgiving or something, but no, not really for us. It's the start of summer. We've just started to get some nice weather finally, so it does feel festive in some ways, as much as, it's so funny, I work with a lot of people who are, not originally from this half of the globe, and they're like, I just can't get rid of the fact that it is warm at Christmas, and it is, I guess that is a bit of a challenge, but it does start to feel festive in our very Australian way, which is nice, hot summers, long days.
I'm quite jealous of that. It's getting really, really cold here. I think we hit freezing, at least like my area, which I guess maybe other places have already hit freezing, and they're mad at me for saying this. But yeah, we just hit freezing like, today or yesterday or something, and yeah, not a big fan of that.
No, that's one thing I don't hate about living in Australia is we don't really get that kind of weather ever, so I'm not going to complain. But no, Week in Flesh and Blood's been good. I have played a little bit of Flesh and Blood. I actually have been looking a little bit at the Living Legend and Blitz formats. It's skirmish season. I was thinking about potentially trying to get along to a skirmish if I had a free day over the next 2 weekends, over the final weeks of skirmish season. Don't know which one I would play, but I was looking, I was like, what is of interest to me right now? Of course, like you say, Chicago's coming up next weekend. You'll be there casting. A lot of people I know out there playing. So I was like, maybe I could pinch someone's a deck and go and play a skirmish with that. And I think this format's interesting. I think, we briefly spoke about it before we jumped in the pod. Let's do a bit of Living Legend next week. The format is quite interesting. I think we should cover some on the pod.
Especially leading up to Calling Chicago, for sure. And while we're talking about other formats, I do want to shout out Dice Commando for recording the Commoner Battle Hardened that happened last weekend at Portland. Yeah, so we recorded those games, and it's up on his channel, so if you're interested in that sort of content, definitely go check that out.
Nice. Andrew, right? That's Dice Commando? Is his name? Yeah, I got to meet him in New Zealand briefly, just very briefly, at the calling. But yeah, no, looking forward to that. And then otherwise, non-Flesh and Blood, it's a weird time of year because a lot of movies are coming out, right? Because it's winter in the Northern Hemisphere. So it's the time of year where movies come out, lead up to Christmas, into the New Year. but also it's like kind of summer here. But we also get movie releases as well. Usually after Christmas, they kind of delay them. But I've been at the movies quite a bit recently, so I'm on a mission this year to watch 150 movies, Pankaj, before the end of the year. I'm not far off. I'm like 116 or 17 at the moment. Seen a couple of movies that have just released this week. So I went and saw things like Wicked, Gladiator 2, things like that. So I'm making my way through Anora. Seen some great movies. So
150, that is
150.
very, very impressive. I don't think I'll be able to do that. Also, yeah, shout out, no, talking about the movies coming out around this time of the year. Yeah, a whole bunch of, quote unquote Christmas movies that are like barely Christmas movies. It's set during Christmas, but for some reason it's a Christmas movie. I always find it really funny.
Like Iron Man 3.
That was a Christmas movie.
It's just set during Christmas.
Okay. Yeah, I think Die Hard is the other one where like, why is that a Christmas movie? It just is.
Just is. Should we get on to the news? Kuala Lumpur
sounds good.
calling this weekend. Class Constructed. Any predictions from you? We've kind of done our Class Constructed predictions as we've gone. What are you thinking this weekend?
We both predicted Enigma to win Calling Portland, and Enigma did win Calling Portland. And that hasn't really changed since then, so it's hard to not just stick with that prediction unless we expect something different region-wise, because Flesh and Blood does have some preferences regionality-wise, and I think in Southeast Asia, aggro is favored a little bit higher than say in Europe and North America. So I'm gonna go with Aurora for this one. I've been saying for a while I think Aurora's the best deck. I'm gonna predict Calling Kuala Lumpur won by Aurora.
I don't hate it. I'm going to make a really rogue pick. I think Dash is going to win this weekend.
Which one?
Nope, just a Dash. I'm taking both. I'm taking both. I think, traditionally, I harken back to Singapore, first ever calling, Dash winning that. Aggro is looked upon fondly in that part of the world. I'm gonna go out there and say Dash is gonna, if not win, we're gonna see one in the top 8 this weekend. If not, probably Enigma.
I could totally see that as well. And I mean, that region of the world, I'm wondering, Alan Lau, I mean, I feel like KL is definitely very travelable for him, and Sam Sutherland as well. Maybe potentially either of those just show up. You tell me a Dash makes top 8, I'm like, yeah, that checks out completely.
Yeah, there's a few people out there. So, yeah, we shall see. We missed talking about Syndra and Fang when the heroes were revealed the other week. So I thought just quickly, first impressions on seeing the heroes. We're going to see the full text of what is the last hero, the Chaos hero. What is it actually called? Do we know the name at all?
We just know it's Arachne so far, and then there's a whole bunch of different versions of them.
Yeah.
Oh, them.
So so we're going to see Arachne on the 17th. In some way, shape, or form, whether that's all of Arachne, all of the versions, whatever it might be. But we do have Syndra and Fang. Thoughts?
I have this thing every time a ninja is spoiled that I'm filled with this desire to really want to play it. And Syndra fills me with the same desire too, but I need to always remind myself that I do not like playing aggro decks, so I don't want to get baited again, because I had the same thing with Phi and with Zen as well. But, I mean, re-equipping daggers, like sending daggers at your opponent, flicking them, and after re-equipping them, that just sounds so flavorful.
Yeah, I agree. I think Warrior and Ninja, not two of my favorite classes, I would say, to be honest. This set is a weird one for me. I don't have big hype levels, honestly. I would say Draconic is, I played a lot of Dromai, but Draconic wasn't necessarily one of my favorite things. I think actually Dromai and Fire are both great heroes, and I thought were very interesting heroes. So I was really keen to see what they might do, and I think there are some very interesting mechanics. Not necessarily from me as a excitement to play them, but I do think it's going to be... I'm actually really excited for Limited, is what I'm excited about the most, honestly. And I'm excited to see how, particularly, I think Fang plays in Limited. That's what's going to be interesting to me. But yeah, I think the once per turn instant, like the 3 resource effect to equip the 2 Draconic Daggers from your graveyard, like it's going to be really cool to be doing this kind of like pinging and throwing, flick knives. There's all these things you could be doing in Constructed as well. So yeah, I'm excited. So I think my question is how, we already have a card pool of Draconic cards, right? To help support your Draconic chain links. What else are we going to get? Because I think they're going to have to be careful about how many Draconic cards they print, really. Like, they're going to have to be careful about it, because they could snowball really quickly, right? So because the effects look powerful, I think there's actually going to be not that many strong Draconic cards. I don't know. That's just how it looks to me on the surface.
I could see that, and there's also hints of that because there's a whole bunch of cards that turn your other cards into Draconic actions.
Yeah.
So that perhaps leans a little bit more into what you're saying as well, right? Where they don't print that many cards, that many strong cards that have Draconic innately on them, but they print cards that get benefits from being turned into Draconic.
Yeah.
And things like that. So I could totally see that. In terms of a hero that I could actually expect myself to play, like I said, Syndra screams to me flavor-wise. I'm super excited for, but I think Fang is more likely something that I'd be more interested in playing. A little bit of Kasai vibes, and to be honest, if Kasai gets support from this set, I'd love to go back to play Kasai as well. Mm-hmm. And honestly, Arachne as well. Like, we know nothing, but the idea of a Chaos Assassin sounds incredibly exciting to me, and also Assassin as a class is something I have started to enjoy.
What I quite like about Fang is fealty tokens, being able to stack fealty tokens, being able to use them in really powerful and creative ways. I think that's kind of what speaks to me, is this ability potentially to set up these crafted turns to build fealty and then to, find these good payoffs. I think when I look at the hero ability, if you control 3 or more fealty tokens, dagger attacks cost you 1 less to activate. I'm super excited about it. Obviously, the other part is that whenever you hit a marked hero, create a fealty token, so you have that generator. But they all feel quite there's a lot of qualifying to these abilities on Fang at the moment, so I am interested to see what the big payoffs of fealty are. I think that's what I'm really interested in.
I'm super curious about the resource base for both these heroes, to be honest. Like for Dromai, we saw that she was mostly red based and she really leaned into Flamescale Furnace. But Fi didn't really want Flamescale Furnace. He still wanted to fund his turns with a blue if he could, to swing the sword and stuff. I'm curious to see where that lands with both these heroes. And like what sort of chess piece they would like to run. Because I am a big fan of Grains of Bloodspill, just as a card, like design wise, and just a lot about it. So I'm secretly hoping for Fang to, run that card, but I could, I'll be curious to see whether maybe he's built around Flamescale Furnace as well.
Yeah, agree. Even when you look at, just going back to my point earlier about, how many Draconic attacks we're going to see, when you look at the cards previewed so far, it's majority class cards. It's not Draconic, not talent cards. So I am interested to see, where those shake out.
Which is awesome because, as we were talking about this the past 2 weeks in the pod as well, the idea about, supporting previous heroes and stuff. And so far, the previews does seem like a lot of the older heroes would like this. Like, Dorinthia definitely comes out to me as someone who'd like Jagged Edge, right? To help the Enigma matchup, for example. So I'm quite excited for the set.
Yeah, I'm sure that'll do a lot for that matchup. We'll see. It might
be a perfect blend of serious and sarcasm.
You can take it whichever way you want. Lastly, in the news, we've got a bit of giveaway that we're going to do next week. So just prefacing it this week that we are going to do a bit of a giveaway next week. Listen out for that. We've got some. We've just received the promo kit from LSS for the Christmas scarf for a scarf. If you haven't seen this, great play on words. There's a cool play mat in there. There's a couple of play sets of scarves for scarves. So we will do a giveaway next week. Be on the lookout for how to get into that.
Yeah, I mean, you can always trust LSS to come up with really good puns and do some cool wordplay. So moving on to the Command and Cookout, this week's question comes from Brendan C. in the Discord. When choosing a deck to play for a tournament, how much weight, if any, do you give to decks that are less mentally taxing to pilot, or even decks where the rounds are significantly shorter in length? Does this factor into your decision-making at all? Let's just start with this one.
Me? Yes and no is my answer. I think it should. No. I'll dive into it. And I'll tell you when it does and when it doesn't. For me personally, I think if the blanket statement is should it, so not just for either of us personally, I think the answer, I think it should be objectively yes, it should. I think you should factor in, your capacity to play. For instance, if you're going to your first ever Tier 4 event, for instance, and you don't have a hero that you're necessarily more well-versed than the other, or there's a few options on the table, I think a deciding factor could be the linear powerful deck that does the thing and allows you to, maybe ease your nerves, not have as many decision points that could cause you challenges in an event. What I will say is that I think those things are all factors you should consider, and it's going to depend on who you are as an individual, whether you should lean more on those things or less on those things. Because at the end of the day, I think more important factors are, is it the right medical? Is it the best deck? Am I comfortable with it? Is even more important than that. But it does weigh in there somewhere. I think I can use a few examples for me, right? Worlds 2022, so 2 years ago, so when I was actually decent at the game, I chose to play Kano at that Worlds, and I think for me that was not a simplicity choice. The format was super complex for Kano. You had the Icelander matchup, you had to navigate Guardian matchups that could or may not be prepared for you. The FAB matchup was basically your only kind of straightforward matchup, and even that was like, it could get complicated depending on how they set up with their equipment suite. So, but on the flip side of that, and I've chosen to play more simple decks. For instance, like Nationals this year, I chose to play Dash Aggro primarily because I wanted a really powerful linear strategy that wasn't targeted like Zen was, basically. That's where I thought a powerful linear strategy, less decision points is good, but that's because that's what I think the format was kind of offering up. So if I look at then fast forward to Worlds, I actually didn't want to play Enigma because I didn't want to play Mirrors. I didn't want to play the new Enigma matchup because I think it's very complex with a lot of decision points. I would have preferred to play something, honestly, that was a bit more straightforward. It just, there wasn't a deck that was speaking to me that had that. So I think for me, yeah, like I have an aversion to playing overly complex decks that can cause me issues of small edges losing me games. But at the same time, I think I also like where I can gain an advantage because my opponent doesn't necessarily understand the game state. So I kind of sit on both sides of that. Like if it's a less known complex deck, that's still really powerful. I think that's actually a really big advantage because your opponent is just as in the dark as you could potentially have been before you tested the deck. So yeah.
Fair enough. That makes a lot of sense. You brought up experience with the deck, and to me that's where like my answer to this is. And for me, my answer is mostly no. I don't really factor that into my decision because I think the more experienced you are with the deck, the less mentally taxing it is to pilot, even if it's a complicated deck. And I've said this before on the pod, I feel like it might be a broken record at this point, which is I always advocate for, and something I always practice is just play the deck I'm most comfortable with. Just play the decks I'm most experienced with. And then that kind of correlates to how mentally taxing it is. And for me, typically the decks I like would be the ones that go on average like 10-ish turns and there's lots of moment of interaction. So Icelander, Kasai, Nu, things like that. So yeah, mostly no for me. I play the one I'm most comfortable with. And the one I have more fun with. The small little consideration I give is that I do avoid fatigue decks partly because of the round timer. I mean, I also don't
not
like
the fun aspect. Okay.
Yeah, I also just don't like them. But also that is something I have considered before. I'm like, oh, if I'm considering this deck for whatever reason, if I'm gonna get over that I don't like playing it. But if the round timer has come in and been like, I don't really want to be in a situation where we go to time. I want to try and avoid that. It just so happens that the decks I like don't really go to that very much anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So my last piece I want to add on this to Brendan's question is that I think people should consider it more than they currently do, to be honest. I think especially if you are a player who's newer to tournament play or environments where it's long days, it is taxing days, I think that should escalate in your prioritization level, if that makes sense. So the less experience you have in these events, the more potential opportunities that there could be for you to make small mistakes, be overwhelmed by unknown game states. Maybe you have less time to prepare, so you just can't prepare all your game plans, things like that. Then I think all those factors should increase your likelihood or your want to play a deck that is more straightforward, less mentally taxing to pilot, easier to pilot, than, say, if you are someone who's spending a lot of time with the deck, or you're someone who is very familiar with this kind of tournament play environment. I think that is a really relevant thing that people should consider.
That's fair. I think that makes a lot of sense. Like when I was giving my answer, I was assuming that the rest of that was kind of taken care of, that you did have all the time you needed to practice. You had all your sideboard plans figured out. You've played at tournaments before. You know what your tournament routine is. For example, what food you want in your bag, your water breaks and all, and like whether you need coffee or not, all that sorts of stuff. To me, I was like, if all that is figured out, then yeah, I wouldn't I don't put too much stock in that, but I think you're
Yeah.
right that if you haven't figured out those things, then this definitely makes sense.
I
To
I think just lastly on that as well, I just want to give a kind of the way I've looked at that. So when I went to PT1, I spent a lot of time working on this dash aggro deck, and a big part of wanting to play that hero and that particular style was that I wanted to play something that was less mentally taxing, had a really proactive plan, and made my opponent have to understand and respond my game plan, including even there was plans in that where I like blocked out, set up triple pounder, and then tried to do 2 big combo turns, right? For instance, and just people not being experienced about how to play against that kind of style. And a big part of that was like, I didn't know at the time how good people were. It was like, I could be in the bottom 10% of play skill at this tournament. I don't know. And so I'm going to go with something that is, I'm also want to finish my rounds quickly. When I went to PT1, honestly, I went, in a big part as a content creator as well, with an opportunity to spend time talking to people and meeting people. And so I was like, I'm just want to play the thing that does the thing. And ultimately I did play a deck that does the thing, quickly. There was a couple of times where I was finished within 5 minutes because my opponent presented AB0, but I played Kano. But, I do think there is, it's not like I've never been in that position before as well. Yeah. So it is, I think it is universal depending on your level.
Well, thank you, Brendan, for asking that question. And if you have a question for the Command and Cookout, feel free to leave that question in the comments below, or you can leave it in the Discord, or you can also come up to one of us at any event that you see us at and pass us your question. With that, Hayden, shall we move on to the main topic?
Yeah, give me your thesis. Give me the context.
Yeah, so we'll start with the context. So, overarching question for today's pod is Flesh and Blood simply a math game? So we alluded a little bit to the context earlier, which is around the Icelander Oldhim era. There was a lot of discourse around math in FAB and how the game was essentially just that. Have a little better math than your opponent on a turn-to-turn cycle basis, and then you're going to win. If you rewind back, you look at a bunch of content that was coming out around then, you'll see a lot of videos, a lot of podcasts where this was the topic at hand. Bullander was a classic example of this. Oldhim as well, with I'm just going to block a little more efficiently than you, send a very efficient hammer at you, and basically across like 12 or 13 turns, I'm just going to have half a point to 1 point more efficient turn cycles than you across the game, and that's how I'm going to win. More recently, we actually saw that a little bit in the heavy hitters meta, especially with, Hatch's Dory is the one that really comes to mind that kind of also executed this sort of game plan. And the question we're tackling today is Flesh and Blood still about that? And a bit of a fallacy in that question as well, because I'm going to argue that even back then, I had some disagreements. I'm not sure if it ever was just about that. But that's the question we're tackling today. Is it about straightforward turn-to-turn math? Now, I will caveat this by saying, if you zoom out far enough, then yeah, sure, it's a math game, but every game is a math game. I mean, sure, if you zoom out far enough, you can just say the game boils down to, did you count to 40 faster than your opponent did? Like, sure, but we're talking a little bit more of a micro level. We're talking on a specific turn-to-turn cycle basis, which
Decision
was
levels.
sort of, which was the sort of foundation that the decks like Bullander, Oldhim, Hatch's Dory were predicated on. So that's the question we're tackling.
Yeah. I want to give a little bit of extra context as well, as someone who's played the game since, day dot, right? First of all, just a quick shout out. If you do want to hear, I guess, kind of where this inception of math and Flesh and Blood math came around, I recommend going and checking out episode 80 of Arsenal Pass. So a very long time ago, we did an episode with Michael Hamilton after he won US Nationals, where we talked about this philosophy of outvaluing turn cycles. And I'm going to specifically reference that because I'm going to talk about it at some point during this discussion around what was actually happening during that meta in particular, and some of the caveats, like you say, around FAB Math. The other one I want to give, as I say, as being someone who's played the game since day zero, whatever you want to say, is that I think a lot of criticism of Flesh and Blood in the early days, particularly Welcome to Wraith only, was that the game was a game of math. That you could deduce it was a game of who had the best hand cycle of damage, right? And to be honest, yeah, that is somewhat true because the card pool was really limited. The best cards in Welcome to Wraith are the cards with the best numbers. And honestly, that still holds true. Sink Belows, Scar for Scars, Winter Bulls, right? E-Strikes. And the reason that these cards were printed in that first set is because they needed a base for the game. They needed these staples for the game that could be used and had adaptability and had core functions of the gameplay and game design. So yeah, that is true. But as the game kind of expanded, I think that got lost pretty quickly, and then it came back, and it's come back cyclically since, in terms of how math derivative the game is. But yeah, I do think just it is worth shouting out that there was this kind of the criticism that was maybe leveled at Flesh and Blood in the very, very early days was people from other games might play and say, well, it's too turn-to-turn math based, it's too nickel and dimey to be a successful game, and obviously those people were wrong. So
you speak about this concept of cyclically coming back into the format or into the game, and the reason why I want to bring it up at this point in time, like why I got reminded of it, was actually because of Ice's return. We spoke about this conversation happening around the Icelander, the Bullander, and Oldham days, who were both Ice heroes, and now Ice is coming back, and it's funny because I feel like Ice is a very clear example of it's not just math.
Yep.
Even though the two very mathy heroes were both Ice. And actually, to do that, so the exercise I want to take us through today, if you will, and whoever's listening, please feel free to join in, is we've listed a bunch of effects in the game. And I just want us to discuss what the math value of some of these effects are.
Okay.
And that's kind of how I would like to illustrate that the game isn't actually just math because of how complex and how variable all these effects are.
Sure.
And the one I want to start with, Hayden, is a frostbite.
All right.
While we're talking about Ice coming back and that being a little bit of an instigator to start a discussion again, what is the value of a frostbite? Well, giving your opponent a frostbite. Because I remember back in the day when people talk about the Icelander's turn cycle, they talk about, I play Aether Hail and a Waning Moon opponent's turn, and that's 6 points because 1 from the frostbite, 2 from the blue Aether Hail, and 3 from the Waning Moon. Yeah. And that 1 from the frostbite was something I always disagreed with. I was like, it is not 1 from a frostbite. It's just so incredibly variable. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it is. It's somewhere between 0 value and potentially
10 or something.
Yeah, potentially. So, I mean, I guess quick example, right? You give your opponent a frostbite, and they were going to have a free floating resource for the turn anyway. I guess the question at that point is, why were they going to have a free floating resource? Is their deck bad, or have they just missed? There's reasons for that as well, but that's kind of by the by. And then upwards of, the term was going to end with me having exact resources to finish with a big finishing flourish. Maybe it involved a Sonata or something to get to 2 specific cards, and then I come in for this damage, and now I've lost the ability to do any of that in my turn because I am now 1 resource short, for instance. It's the same as, if my tunic was only on 3 here instead of 2, I could do X, Y, Z, right? So, yeah, the value of a frostbite is variable, very, very variable.
One of my favorite interactions from back in the day, back in the Icelander days, was when Azaleas would forget to side out Crow's Nest into me.
Oh, yeah.
And typically how the method works, they would Azalea in something. And once they activate Azalea, if I don't respond to that, I don't have a priority window before they send that arrow, unless they have Crow's Nest.
Yeah.
And they'll forget about it, and they'll be like, hey, I haven't been disrupted yet. And then they'll go inside the arrow in, and I'll be like, wait, I'm going to respond to Crow's Nest. He gets the frostbite, and you just lost all your buffs and that arrow, basically, because you can't send it at me anymore. Or to, Cold Snap, for example, because maybe you're playing on 1 frostbite, and the Cold Snap is like taxing them too. And that's one of the situations where I was like, okay, my frostbite or my tax effect was worth way more than just 1 or 2. And on the flip side, I have these games against Oldham where they literally do not care that I've given them a frostbite because their turn's already done. They kind of just do like 1 action. And then that frostbite at the end doesn't do anything. And unless I have a frost text on them, that frostbite isn't doing anything. I'm probably not even going to play my card because of how the frostbite has 0 value.
Yeah, I'm sure we're gonna go through a few. I know you've got a few more effects to go through. I just want to quickly seed this for as we go forward. The math involved in ice decks, in my view, has never been about the talent. It has been about the cards that help support the core of the deck. And I think that's actually, we can talk about it more. I think that is the majority of what math and FAB is. And the reason I think it's cyclical is because it ebbs and flows how big a proportion of your deck is math versus breadwinning game plans, right, for instance. But we can talk more about that. Just want to seed it.
Fair enough. All right, the next effect I want to talk about, while still keeping in the ice theme, Winter's Bite. Let's go with blue Winter's Bite. On the surface, it's using a card for 1 resource from them. But I think in practice, we've all been on the side of this card is so incredibly annoying. I mean, Coronet's Peak was very strong equipment on Icelander for this reason, right? It was Winter's Bite on stick, effectively. So, thoughts on the math value of blue Winter's Bite?
Winter's Bite is an action speed, right? Or is it
Action speed, but it does have go again.
It has going, yeah. Yeah, I mean, same sort of thing, right? Sometimes it's going to eat a tunic counter. Sometimes it's going to eat a whole card. To be honest, when it was eating a tunic counter, it was probably being pitched to Coronet Pig, for instance.
Yeah, you probably won't pay it.
Yeah. But
unless they're a CLF around or something, so they can't tunic.
Exactly, yeah. But it's again, it's very variable. I would say it's maybe less variable than a Frostbite, for instance, because it's not instant speed, it's action speed. But yep, again, very variable.
Yeah, also one of those things where your decision to play it is like you wouldn't play it into a tunic card, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So most of the time when you're playing it, you are trading a card for a card. So it kind of seems like it's even, except like this is like your blue talented card, and also depending, like typically at ice decks aren't really trying to scale with their hands, and it's very, very strong against decks that are trying to scale. And again, I mean, this whole scaling thing is again where this comes down to, right? If I'm against an Olden, this back in the day, I didn't really care. Like, I never wanted to resolve this card into them because they'll just like pay one and also Crown of Seeds, and then I'm left looking like a fool. But into like something like a 5, this is something I always want to resolve against them. Again, just going back to how variable and how nebulous this idea of math is, particularly when considering the ice decks. All right, next one, Command and Conquer. Oh, this one's really, really interesting because I feel like back in the day, like particularly I think before Enigma, actually, it was very much okay. If they don't have an arsenal, fine, it's a 2 for 6. If they have an arsenal, it just goes back to a scaling thing. It's a 5 or something. You force 3 cards of blocks from them, or they take 6 and lose the Artivore. That happens so often. Then your value in a CNC is incredible. Now, though, there's the added value of just the defense reactions can't be played to it, which has been a very, very interesting evolution of this card as well. And again, just something that I find very, very difficult to attribute a math value to. But like we all have been in the spot where you just send a CNC against Enigma, whether they have an arsenal or not, it still just feels very, very strong.
Yeah, I mean, I think it the value again is massive. Like you talk about defense reactions, you know, how valuable is potentially leaving them with a dead card. How potential, you know, value of now they can't block efficiently to save their arsenal if they care about it. That could be, you know, it could be worth somewhere around 14, right? It could be a 2-card 14. Or, you know, it's just purely a 2-card 6, and that is at times, depending on the format, terrible. And one thing I would say when it comes to CNC, and there's the variable math aspect, there's also the variable impact aspect. At times where I think it's more of a math game, quote unquote, right, where value is more important. Actually, CNC is at its worst, I think, because what decks aren't doing is trying to set up big turns. They aren't trying to utilize the arsenal for full value. They aren't trying, you know, your deck isn't doing other powerful things. Your CNCs need to be worth more. And when your CNCs worth more, great. They're great to have in the deck. But when it's more math orientated and your CNCs are taking up a slot that could be a Wounded Bull or another just better math card, because it doesn't have the impact on your opponent's side of the table. So I think it's really interesting that it's almost counterintuitive that actually at the time where CNC is as a power level where a 2 for 6 is more relative, it's actually worse, I think.
Yeah, against something like a Hatchet's Dory or something, you never want to resolve this card. It just doesn't do
terrible.
Anything. And then we also have the additional complications of does the opponent have Crown of Providence, for example, and then like what happens to the math of your CNC, and then does the opponent like defense reactions, and you know, like against a Florian or something. There's plenty of times where you CNC them and it's like, wait, this is actually kind of annoying because of my Ruban Carapace in my arsenal, and I really wanted to decompose with it to turn on my decompose on the following turn, and it can just lead to so many awkward situations.
Yeah.
It can be very much more than a 2 for 6, or as you say, sometimes it's just like, they literally did not care and just give you 2 cards, and like, wow, that was so severely underrated. You just went 2 cards and an action point for their 2 cards.
And you feel even worse because you wasted a resource as well.
Yeah, exactly. So I think so far we've been been 2 old men like yelling at the clouds because we're talking about like these ice cards and we're talking about like old cards.
You've got some new stuff, don't you? I can feel it.
Yeah, I'm gonna shift to like a new card, which I think is actually fascinating when we think about the math of a card. I want to start with Red Malefic Incantation.
Oh.
Like, what is the math on this card? I feel like it's on the surface, it's just okay, it makes you 3 rune chance over the course of 3 turns. But then once you start to factor in either Viscerai's amplifying effects with stuff like Moderate Tide, or Vincent's sort of resource cheating effects with being able to rune get something because there's an additional rune chant, the math on this card just sort of just goes all over the place.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about this card, I agree, you Moderate Tide turn, etc. What is interesting about this card is that its baseline value is, in theory, just strong. Like if it's Viscerai, it's a 0 for 4, there or thereabouts, right? You trigger your Viscerai ability. But as soon as you say you take in all your variable aspects of, did you create a rune chant this turn? Okay, my swarming has go. All these things on top of it. That's where you really start to see the value of this card. So it is a big variable value. But interestingly, unlike other heroes, where if I was to use say a plus minus graph, so you've got 0 in the middle and then you've got plus 10 and negative 10 value, right? That your cards can flux between depending on the situation. In this instance, the value is only positive above rate, whereas some cards, it's like CNC on a scale, it can be -2, right? Because you've done a 2 card 6 instead of a 2 card 8, for instance. So on like a general value proposition, it could be a -2, whereas on this, it's always going to be flat or positive and when I talk about that, I'm saying a 1 card 4 as being the baseline. So it's an interesting one. It is very varied, but it's in a slightly different direction.
I think you bring up a very good point there, and I think that's sort of like what I want to stress as well. I think like this isn't a oh my god, guys, stop thinking only about math sort of like topic that we've got going on here. But I think it's more of I think math is a great tool to sort of gauge the ceilings and floors of your cards, like what you're talking about on the plus minus scale. But to reduce the game to this is just math on a turn to turn cycle basis, I think that's where I disagree. And I think if that were the case, I think Ira and Florin would be among the best decks in the format, but that's not the case. But in terms of like evaluating power of cards, math is a great tool to be like, this is the worst my card could be, like the CNC, for example, but it's also how high it could be. And using that to decide what cards you're going to put in your deck and how you want to play your turn cycle is very, very effective. But it's not just what the game's about, I think.
No, I mean, at the end of the day, you want cards that are going to produce good damage or good effects. Like that is how you're going to build a deck that wins the game. So at some level, like you said, kind of at the top, there is mathematical elements to that. I want my cards on average to be a high value. Like I want to play cards that are high value. Some of those will at a surface level be low value, but the way they interact with the rest of my deck, the kind of synergy benefits make them high level, right? That just is, like for instance, I'll use blue Movrian Skies, right? If you look at that card on rate, it's like, okay, it's a blue rune chant on hit, but it just gives go again. Like what's
it's head jab. It's basically
right.
blue. It's
well,
oh yeah, sorry.
Yeah, it depends, right? It kind of depends, right? Right. Weird. But it blocks 2. It can potentially just be terrible, right? But the card was so important to old Viscerai decks because you needed the go again to have any synergy to derive power from the rest of your deck. So it's an enabler, right? So I think you have these cards that are like, okay, they're core. And this is what I was saying before about there's times where cards that are just good value by themselves, so 1 or 2 card or 3 card value. And here's an example, right? A Snatch, a Wounded Bull, and Glacial Footsteps. There's a difference between 1, 2, 3 card value there, right? Okay. And then when those are more prevalent in decks, then yes, I think you focus more on math. But when it's more about, okay, I need good synergy to derive the ability to do powerful things. But yes, you still want good value cards in your deck. I'll use Enigma, for example, right? You're still going to play good value cards in that deck more than some other decks, but there's still a body of power in there versus something like a Kasai or even an Icelander you spoke about. Although I think Icelander is often misrepresented because it was focused on the Wounded Bull side. There wasn't actually that many value-based cards. There was still a lot of below-rate cards. It's just use these math cards to bring up the average value before it did bonkers stuff like Storm Stride as you.
All CLF.
Yeah.
At instance, which is just like, again, like what the heck is the math on a CLF at instant speed, right? It's kind of just infinite. You do that. Your fire's like Out of War, and you're like CLF, and your 2 cards bought like 10 life or even more because you're also going to keep it around the following turn. All right, so moving on to the next sort of synergy piece in the decks, the next sort of effect I want to talk about. Hiss and Venomous Bite.
Mm.
Again, it's in that if you look at the raw math on these cards, it's actually not very, very good. This Hiss is a 1 for 4 at reaction speed. Sorry, no, Hiss is 1 for 3, and then go again. Venomous Bite is a 1 for 4 at reaction speed. Nothing to really write home about when we're talking about these other math cards being the likes of Scar for Scar and Wounded Bull. Yet these are incredibly powerful cards, and that's where on hits come in, right? And that's kind of the other axis that we haven't quite touched on yet, which is the role of on hits in terms of breaking this math paradigm.
Yeah, well, just look at a card like Pummel. Like you can even use Pummel, which has a built-in on-hit effect in it, right? If it's a 2-card, 2 resource plus 4 damage for 2 cards, effectively, you get a resource left over. That's very different to it pushing, first of all, its own on-hit effect, where now you're looking at a 2 resource plus 4 damage, and they discard a card. Okay, now you're starting to talk. Now that's in the realm of being around or slightly above rate. If that also tacks on, for instance, pushing across a crush effect, then they discard a card, or they lose their arsenal because it's attached to a CNC. Now you're at a very different league. So that's different, I guess, stratifications of levels of the impact of cards.
And then there's this whole nebulous aspect, because we're talking about reactions here, which is just the existence of them and the sort of random incidental value you get just from the fact that they exist in your deck, right? Like, I mean, as Nu, for example, CYB Nu was an amazing example of this. But you just send a surgical to the opponent, and you have one floating, you're tuning up, and you're holding a card. And the opponent's like, what are they going to play around? Venomous Bite, a Hiss, and the potential for you having a Chi. And they decide they can't play around any of those, and they just let it hit, and then you go tune and count your blessings, for example. Or they play around one of your things, and you have the other reaction, for example. So, and that's, I feel like we're cheating a little bit, maybe by bringing that up, because we're not talking about math of the effect itself anymore. We're not talking about math of resolving the card, but we're talking about just the math existing in your deck.
Being around, being available. You're also talking about you can also talk a little bit about the absence of math in that situation as well. And I'll give an example, and there's a real reason I don't like playing attack reaction decks. And I'll use Dorinthia as an example, right? So the presence of good math in that deck is, I would say, limited. It does revolve a lot around on-hit effects and having the right reactions at the right time, right? And to your point earlier,
it starts to get really good once you have your first Domblade counter. But yeah,
100%, yes. But again, that's synergistic effect, right? That's building that in, and you have to build your deck around that. And I'll take your surgical extraction piece before, right? If your opponent decides I can't play around this, decides to not block, and you don't have those things because you just haven't drawn them and your hand is awkward or whatever, you have been, you're not getting the value on them blocking because they're over blocking, etc. And you're not getting value out of your, those pumps like you're talking about because you don't have them, right? Like you don't have the extra on hits or whatever it is, or they just have the singular defense reaction and they play it. There's also this kind of absence of the math as well, where this is the reason I just have struggled to play these decks in the past, is that it forces your hands to line up in the right way, but it also relies on how your opponent plays the game. And for me, that's one too many variables. And this is getting a little bit off track, I guess, in terms of just the general idea of is math, it's FAB Math game. But what I want to get across from this point is that I think this is a really relevant piece of how you decide to build and play decks in Flesh and Blood, is that the more elements you pull into it, where it becomes around deck building, your lines of play, and your opponent's lines of play. To Brendan's question, the Commander Cookout, right? Deck complexity. This is kind of deck complexity, but you don't control all of it. I'm not a big fan of that, and I actually think we've seen that it's not been the most consistent thing to do in Flesh and Blood. And as we talked about last week, consistency is massive. So, yeah, bit of a tangent.
It does. I think your answer there definitely is very in character with your response to the Commander Cookout.
Not fully off.
You want to be Yeah, you want to be the one doing the linear thing, the one like asking the questions, and then your opponent is the one that needs to sort of react to you, rather than these reaction decks like Warrior and Assassin are more like you're sort of reacting to them or hoping they behave a certain way, and that's how you get full value out of your cards. On my end, I love the mind games that it proposes, to be honest.
Sure.
I love the am I representing this, am I representing that? And I think there's a lot of skill to navigate your turns around your opponent doing these different things. Like having a plan for if they block a certain way versus not. But yeah, I think you are right. It is one of the sort of drawbacks of these sort of strategies. But I will contest. I think Assassin was very, very strong in PT Amsterdam, for example. So it's not that historically this sort of strategy has been weak. I think there have been metas where that was very strong, and Hedge's Dorian was also very, very strong in heavy hitters meta.
Yeah, Hedge's was
Even though
slightly different though. Like it was a math deck in some ways, to the point
True.
of interestingly, it was a deck about extracting value because boots. What are the boots called?
Valiant Dynamos.
Yeah, Valiant Dynamo is very powerful. You're using value based in a format that could kind of support that. On the flip side, right. I would my counter argument to the Assassin piece, and maybe one of the reasons I could be very biased on this, and just the reason I've kind of stayed away from it. I think that Assassin was very good at Amsterdam, if not Nu being the best pick for the format. I think a lot of that was format specific, honestly, and I do think that these decks that have to propose questions and answers at the same time is a very difficult place to be. And I think when you look at it, they just haven't had the most success. And it comes down to something we spoke about last week of consistency, is redundancy, which is redundancy equals consistency. And those decks don't have the same redundancy because they rely on two-factor input. So they rely on you having the specific attack action and the specific attack reaction, right? As opposed to some decks that go, for instance, I'll flip to Guardian, right? I need some blues, doesn't matter what they are, and attack. That's what so their specific situational need is lower. Which I think I'll just quickly loop it back, which loops back to why Math and Flesh and Blood has at times been so important, is because the piece of reducing that is, okay, I have a good value card and the resource to support it, and that's all I need. I don't need specific resource card or specific attack, just value. I can play my Wounded Bulls, my Finder's Fighting Spirit, and my whatever Battlefront Bastion, right? And I've got these cards work on defense, they work on offense, they work all with all my blues.
I think the point you brought up about I think that decks like the Assassin works in very targeted metas. I think it also goes to show that those decks are, in a sense, sort of torn in different directions as well, right? It's like they need to do something very, very different if they're against an aggro deck versus if they're against like a defensive deck, like a Guardian or an Enigma, and that kind of just taxes them a little bit. Whereas the more proactive linear decks, they're doing their thing, and it's on their opponent to react to them differently, which I think also goes back to what you're saying, where it's kind of meta dependent, and Assassin being strong in Amsterdam was a bit of an outlier. And I think that makes history definitely agrees with you there, right? We've had the strongest decks in the past being stuff like Lexi, being stuff like Dromai, and even like Bull Ender to that extent, which is they are doing their thing almost regardless of what their opponent is up to.
Yeah, for sure. But I mean, one thing I will say, and this is, I guess, to answer this question a little bit about where Math sits in Flesh and Blood, I think it's really important to have all of these things. It's important to have metas where the deck that is less consistent and is more of a situational answer has to fight between, potentially being proactive and reactive is the best deck in the format. Like, I want those situations to be true. If anything, I think, consistency and redundancy has been too strong, and decks can default to consistency and redundancy in conjunction with power. I think that's what Enigma's doing right now, to be honest. I think that's why it's the best deck in the format. I think I want times where that is not the best option. Like, I'm okay if it's like 60 to, like, I think it will always be the majority, is my view, is that decks that have a powerful core and can support it with good math, right? Just cards that are just good value, are going to a lot of the time be the default place to go. But when something is an outlier, this is why I actually really liked Dash, and what it did for the World's meta was it was such a wild card. It did something so powerful. It had so little redundancy. You needed such specific cards to pull off turns, right? I mean, look at freaking Sam Sutherland's games. He chose to play a system reset deck, right? Because the power level was so high. And I know this is something that we've had Brian on the pod talk about this. They want to raise the ceiling on decks, but they also want to lower the floor, right, around consistency. And I think when it comes to the Math and Flesh and Blood, I think the more that we have these little spikes of getting away from that in its entirety and just being purely synergistic or purely, no overlap and no redundancy, I think those are such exciting times to be playing the game, and they're really interesting. But on the flip side, as someone who loves to be able to do something consistent and show up to events and feel like I have put myself in a position to do well and not have be at the total mercy of variance, I think you do need a balance, right? So it's interesting.
I completely agree. And I think this meta is actually a very, very strong testament to the game sort of offering both sides of it. I think there's been a lot of discourse going on about how this meta is really, really fun and really, really good. And I think part of that is to what you're talking about. There is this breadth and strategies. You have the more like mathy decks. I would put like almost like Aurora in that sort of like she just has slightly more efficient than you turn after turn, and every now and then she draws a card, which is kind of just increasing just how overtly efficient she is. But she isn't too much built around okay, I have this one super synergistic give you like 30. I guess she does have flicker arc lightning, but she's not really like some matchups she built around it. I can't contradict myself in this thing, but normal turn to turn cycle thing is in the sort of 2-card 8, 3-card 12
it is.
Sort of thing. But then on the other side, you have the super synergistic stuff, and I think like Viscera is one example where like they're gonna spend a couple of turns setting up and hit you with a massive Mordred turn where they pop like 2 to 3 Malefic Incantation triggers and maybe even ninth blade you and just deal a bunch of damage on one turn at the cost of setting up a little bit. And then there's also Enigmas and Zens, which are sort of playing math, sort of playing synergy, but on different axes altogether.
Yeah, what I think we spoke about this multiple times actually since we've potted together, and you've harped on this, which I've really liked, is that previously aggro decks, it's just like there's just one aggro deck because it's the aggro deck that has the best damage or has the best, again, math, right? It's the fastest, it has the best damage. And we've moved away from that because I think in part they've removed a lot of offensive overlap, so it's just not the best damage anymore. And instead, these aggro decks find more to their niches, or they line up differently into different matchups because they do their damage in different ways, whether that be over the course of multiple turns or on the course of a single turn, or even the course of a single turn, but is it tall versus wide damage over the course of multiple turns? Is it setup based, or is it because they're able to push through 2 to 3 turns of overinflated damage, for instance? So that's so interesting that they've been able to do that, to your point previously. And again, a lot of that I think comes from the absence of math. A lot of aggro decks right now, you pointed out Aurora having math, yes, I agree, but a lot of other aggro decks don't. And when they do have math, it's in line with what other decks are able to do. The difference with something like Aurora is that it also has access to smaller spikes, but can do it consistently because it has the strong weapon. So it is, I think, quite a fascinating meta right now. And this is why I'm really interested to see what the Hunter does, because how do they balance bringing in potentially another aggressive ninja? Or maybe it's not even an aggressive ninja, but Draconic has traditionally been more proactive into this kind of meta. So, yeah.
Speaking of things that I harp about, and we have sort of tangented quite far away.
Yeah, but you're listening to Arsenal Pass, so what do you expect?
Yeah, I was like, what else do you expect? The other thing I harp about is flavor, and then the point I want to bring up with the whole, lack of offensive overlap with the banning all those art wars and stuff, is the thing that I really enjoy about the fact that we have many aggro decks is that they all have leaned into their class and talents a lot more. Like Aurora, for example, it used to be that, Zen is a better aggro deck because he plays Out of War better than Fi plays Out of War, and you have to play Out of War because that card is broken. Because now it's kind of like, or you think about Aurora's power cards, and it's Channel Lightning Valley. It's Arc Lightning. Yeah. It's very much her power cards, her stuff. You think about Zen, you think about the Mystic talent, you think about ninja cards, like a lot of them are like Wax-ons now as well to help overcome the aggro mirrors, for example. You think about the Zen State token. It's right, you think about like Moderate Tide, you think about Rebel, you think about these Malefic Incantations. They've all started leaning into their own classes and their own talents, and I love that from an identity and flavor perspective as well, rather than just, I play Out of War better, therefore I'm the better aggro deck.
Yeah.
Or I played Biblical better back in the day. And I'm a big fan of that.
Yeah, I think nailed it, right? It forces them to because there's just less good math cards to play. And aggro particularly, I will say right now in more mid-range decks, I think that is not the case, right? Like there is just... And the reason there's less of these math-based generic cards is because of a specific philosophy, right, that LSS have enacted, which I think is fantastic. If you look at the next stage up, I think a lot of those cards still exist, the Sync Belows, the E-Strikes of the world, but they're not as impactful, right? They're just not as impactful. So you can have more of those in a given deck without having the same amount of impact as just having 3 Art of War, for instance, does at a generic level. So yeah, it is this idea of where I think, again, FAB Math sits right now, as it sits less than it ever has before in the aggro slot. But it might be somewhere equivalent to where it has sat in the past. If I go back, I look at the Oldhams, the Icelanders of the world, I think the Enigmas and the Florians of the world are still pretty similar in terms of the amount of kind of math-based cards they play. I'll use just one final example, I think, when it comes to the aggro piece. Not just not just these power cards like Art of War, etc., but I'll use a card like Channel Mount Heroic, specific to the hero. And I think the other interesting thing is that the hero design also limits this a little bit to that flavor and kind of playing within class aspect. Briar, because of its embodiments of lightning ability, right? Plus the access of cards it had to, plus the embodiments of Earth. What it could do is basically it went, okay, I'm going to play Channel Mount Heroic, and then I'm just going to play the best cards that say go again on them to enable my Channel Mount Heroic. And we're just not in a space anymore where that kind of works, and I think that's cool. So
we've definitely seen them shift towards heroes having more of the identity printed on the text box, because that was the issue with Briar, right? The text box didn't say anything about elements. It didn't say, it just said you play 2 non-attacks to get the emblem of lightning. It didn't care what talent those non-attacks were. And it just said if you dealt damage, you make an embodiment of Earth. Again, not really caring how the damage was dealt. Whereas the more recent stuff, I mean, you look at Hunted, for example, and it's like Draconic and Fealty is everywhere. Mystic was similar. I mean, Mystic all have Chi printed on the text box as well. Rosetta as well. Earth, Lightning is on the heroes' text boxes, on the weapons. And yeah, I completely agree. The shift is very, very visible, and on my end at least, I do appreciate that a lot as someone who really enjoys the flavor behind heroes.
Yeah.
And feeling like my class and talent.
Yeah, I mean, I'm coming around more to that the more I play Flesh and Blood as well. What else do you want to talk about, Winford? Because I have a couple of things I would love to, I guess, maybe finish on, which is about how I look at FAB Math these days and how I use it. But is there anything just from a more big picture or things that you wanted to kind of go over?
So most of it I already did say, but I will just reiterate again. I think, to me, the game is not about turn-to-turn cycle math. It isn't just about that. I think some strategies are about that, but I wouldn't say the game as a whole is about that. But I will say that I think looking at ceilings and flaws of your cards in terms of math is very, very useful from a card evaluation perspective. But again, it's I disagree with the premise that the game boils down to that.
Yeah, I would really echo card evaluation as FAB Math being one of the key tools of how you base level evaluate a card, at least to start with, before you start to look at synergy. The other thing I'll say is that at a very level of inception when it comes to deck building, I think the easiest way often to deck build is to find the things that do the most consistent turn-to-turn damage, right? Like that is just a really easy jumping off point. And the other thing it can do as well is it can help you enable or kind of differentiate what is the core of my deck doing versus what is the support packages of my deck doing. So we talked about before, cards like E-Strike, Sink Below, Sigils, cards that are just kind of value, right? How much of those cards your deck wants to play is really going to depend. And there's kind of this tipping point where it gets to the point where it's like, my deck is now so synergy based that I can't afford to play these cards because if I draw them, they hurt the average output of all my other cards. So I'll use an example, right, of Viscerai. You can play so little of these generic value cards in a deck like Viscerai because each one of those that you need to contribute or play to a turn is going to reduce the output of a big Mordred Tide turn, for instance. It's going to reduce the amount of rune chance you make to just play something like Amplify the Arcanine. So that tipping point is really quick. That happens really quickly. Like playing, for instance, more than 3 defense reactions could do that to you very, very quickly. On the flip side of that, a current deck, we've talked about Enigma a little bit, but I'm going to go back to something like Icelander. Yes, you need blue ice cards, and yes, you need some payoffs, but actually the tipping point for that was more around somewhere around like the 20 mark, because you just kind of needed 2 of those in a hand cycle, not 4 of them like you need in Viscerai. So if I have my blue ice card to pitch, and I have my blue ice card to stick in Arsenal, my other cards could be an Emeritus Scolding and a Wounded Ball, for instance, right? So that's kind of quite an interesting fact I like to look at when it comes to using FAB Math is like, I'm going to attribute FAB Math to a lot of these kind of inherently generic cycle to cycle just value cards, and I'm going to work out how they fit into my deck. But when it comes to actually, I guess, core deck building or using math, that is, I think math and FAB, you start with it a lot and you taper away as you tune decks, as you play the games. But at a base level, if something doesn't make sense in terms of the value you're getting out of turn cycles, it's probably not very good. That is just a lens to put over things. But as you get into things, as you work out synergies, find where spikes are, how you set up turns, how you build for certain matchups. I mean, I will use the Icelander mirror as an example, where at times the math did not matter. You sat there and you IP'd yourself because the game was really played in bringing your opponents to be like shields down or towards an end game where they didn't have the same density of cards to be able to respond with that you did. So, yeah, I think that's all the...
Or you shoot yourself to charge your own Illuvian, which happened a lot in Iceland Mirrors
Exactly.
as well, which is, what is the math in that? It's like you're kind of negative math now to go plus math a bit later. Wizard Mirrors are absolutely awesome. You brought Visrai, and the synergy and anti-synergy of these generic math cards in a deck like Visrai. And I love that you brought it up, because that was actually part of my strategy into Visrai as new, was taking advantage of them trying to go into this sort of math basis. You talk about how you put all these defense reactions in your deck, and now your Moderate turn, your Magic Tide turn gets weaker. But I want to go a step further and say your overall strategy also, in a sense, gets weaker. Because what I think a lot of Visrais, like what I noticed happened when I'm new against Visrai, they're putting all these defense reactions in. They've got these sinks, some of them even on fates and rule barriers and stuff. So okay, so they get to like defend against my disruption, and they set up a bunch of the game. But after the combo turn, like any turn that they send anything at me, as long as I play disciplined enough and I just commit my entire hand to blocking, I know that there's a very decent chance they're going to draw the defensive pieces on their following turn, and then kind of just give me back the value that I lost by just putting my entire hand down. So, stuff like, oh, I have a live Bonds of Agony, but my opponent decided to attack me with a board of 9 rune chance. I'm like, cool, yeah, I don't care about the Bonds of Agony, just block completely. But because you've sort of gone down this path of putting these anti-synergistic but good math cards in your deck, I know that you're going to draw back into them and kind of be bricked.
Yeah, it's like this whole idea of being the reason that consistency in one game plan is so good is because you always know that it's there. And when you go from being this really proactive linear deck to now I kind of want to be reactive, but sometimes want to be proactive, and then you throw in the third element, which is the anti-synergy, it's just a recipe for disaster. It's like people looked at my Nationals deck I played and they're like, oh, you don't play like... You play one induction chamber. Like, what about if you want to play the pistol package? Or what about defensive cards for like the new matchup? It's like they don't actually help on the grand scheme of things. They help you in terms of you can play a different game plan. But actually, is that game plan any better? And that is the question it comes down to. You can play these cards. You can play the anti-synergistic pieces. And you can have sideboard cards and prep for a matchup. But if the gain that you get from the net gain you get from playing these defensive elements or these cards that work better into specific situations actually offset because you're now negative in your damage outputs and the big turns you can have. Like, I talked to Sam Sutherland about this. He's like, what's your plan against No? He's like, I'm taking max velocity out. I was like, I'm not. Like, my best turns if I can resolve a max velocity. That's the only way I'm winning this matchup. So it's like, it's such an interesting kind of... I think that's where deck building comes in. I think that's where game plans come in. And I think that is something that people often misinterpret and get wrong, is they try to do too many things. They look at the things they're trying to solve without actually realizing all the issues they're causing in their deck and in their plans.
And on the flip side, and it's this might sound like I'm contradicting, but I mean, this is how deep the game is, right? On the flip side, sometimes maybe the matchup's that bad that you just need to add these elements of variance in, and you just need to hope that you draw these cards in the correct order, or you just lose every time.
Yep.
Right. For example, if you are the synergy-based deck like a Visrai and you just try and play completely normal into a disruptive deck like New, a lot of times just not able to do anything. So then you're like, all right, so put this D reacts in, and hopefully they line up. I'm gonna put Snags. I think Snag was a very big one back when New was very, very meta. Right? I had an Azalea play Snag against me, for example, because they were just like, if this doesn't line up, then I'm going to lose anyway. And my way to win is to just add this element of variance, which bricks me a little bit. But my only path to winning is if I hit this little bit of the high roll. And that's also something that needs to be considered, and it's very relevant.
Yeah, agree. What a great game we play with a lot of complexity that isn't just mathematic based and turn cycle based, Pankaj.
Yeah, I completely agree. I'm glad. I mean, I know we both were already on a similar page before we started, and hopefully some of the listeners have also come around to that. But with that, I think I've said my piece on math in the game. Anything else from you?
I think just lastly, I really want to point out that this whole idea of where mathematics plays into flesh and blood and turn cycle math in particular. So now I'm not talking about deck building anymore. I'm now talking about just pure turn cycle math. I think it was always misunderstood. I think it was always used as this is the primary game plan. And to the point about Icelander, that was never the primary game plan. It was a support plan that made the deck better and made your mirror match better, for instance, right? It's because all the turns in between, all the ridiculous powerful stuff you did, you just got to play a better value game. And it came at a low cost because of what I said before around the synergy impacts were low. If I use Ultim as an example, right? That is more of your key game plan, is just to play good value turns. But let's not forget that you had an insane hero ability and you had Crown of Seeds, right? So the more of the cards sat in the value bucket, but actually it was to complement a very small core game plan, which required few cards. So I think whenever you talk about turn cycle, and this is, I think, just a great lens to take away for people to think about with their deck building and their game plans, whenever you think about good turn cycle math, I think the first starting point is, what does that look like as a combination of cards in my deck relative to what my core game plan is? Because at the end of the day, if you don't have a core game plan, if your core game plan is just play value, honestly, I don't think those decks are very good. We actually haven't seen many of them because they just don't really exist. Like if I use Kasai as an example, people will say, well, that is a good example of that. I think that is a fairly good example of method, but Blood on Her Hands or Raise an Army, like these things are the most powerful things that Kasai could do. If you didn't have those things, Kasai would be unplayable. So I think that's my counterpoint to all that.
Yeah, I actually disagree that Kasai was a pure math deck. If you want to talk to me about like a warrior that's a math deck, Hatchet's Story to me is the one that comes to mind. Like she has like maybe like a kind of power turn with Spill Blood, I suppose. But really most of her turn cycles are the same, and she just wants to get like 2-card 9s the whole game, right? Mm-hmm. With swing both hatchets, block with Dynamo. Whereas Kasai, I think, is actually very much I'm doing efficient math, but then eventually I do want to pay that off with like a Blood on the Hands or Raise an Army turn. And unlike Oldhim, Oldhim was kind of, this is the way I win. And you spoke about the core game plan, about making sure these math turns are contributing to your core game plan. And and that's just it. I think like Kasai is the one where your math turns are contributing to your final pop-off push turn. Whereas something like Oldhim was more of a, this is actually how I win. I'm just going to win by doing more math. Yeah. Icelander as well was doing good math until she does her Stormstriders with a Waiting Moon and card from Arsenal and DD 10 on your turn kind of thing, right? So the math is like leading towards a call game plan, supporting the call game plan as you were saying it, but it was not, this is the call game plan. No, the call game plan is sort of out efficient you and then combo finish you. I think Kasai is very, very similar as well. There's something like Oldhim and Hatch's Story are more of the way I beat you is by more math. Even KO, I think people speak about KO as being very mathy, which he was, but again, until you get Blood Rushed, like
exactly,
like back to back,
math's
right?
out the window.
And then you just die.
Yeah. I think people confuse sometimes that the amount of, I guess, cards played or the amount of time spent doing a single thing, like that's the game plan. So if I spend most of my time in my games playing Kasai, blocking with 2 cards and then pitching a card, attacking with 2 weapons, giving one go again, and using my valid dynamos, that's the majority of my time. But that's not my game plan. It's not the majority of what my deck is built around. It just happens to be the outcome of how I get to that point. So I think that's very true. Also, on the Dory piece, I honestly don't know how 2 Dories top 8 that PT. I just thought that deck was close to unplayable, but I don't know.
But it was very good into KO. And KO was very well represented.
It's true. It's true. And they had a game plan into Dromai that most Dromais weren't prepared for, I will say. So it was a meta. It's, again, like the Assassin piece, I think, meta-based result there.
But in the end, Dromai won that PT anyway. So
yes, because it was the best. But I think that's great that formats can have that metas can have that element or that angle where it's like, you know what, it's not the best consistent linear powerful deck, regardless of how much turn cycle math is involved in it. It is the specific thing for the specific reason. And in that case, it was Hatch's Story because it had good math plans. paired into two of the best decks in the format, if not the two best decks in the format. In Azuri's case, or News case for Amsterdam, it's because it specifically targeted the best deck in the format that was overwhelmingly the best deck outside of those two decks, right? So I like
Man, that heavy hitters meta was actually so funny. I feel a lot of people even now look back on it being like, oh man, that was just mid-range soup, that was just mathy. And I was like, I remember Prism and Kano being very, very like large menaces in that format as well, which is definitely not mid-range soup decks. So I'm just like, I'm not sure why people have that impression. I guess maybe some of those were discovered a little bit after PTLA, and maybe that's why. But to me, heavy hitters is like what we've been talking about before. There's a breadth of strategies. There were the pure math mid-range soup decks, but then there were also entirely anti-math decks, and then there was the Kasai's and the KOs, which were like kind of mathy, but then do big turns as well.
Yep, interesting. I also think that the most powerful strategy in that format, it wasn't as far above as people like to think, or even formats since have been. Like, I think that to me, Dromai and KO were the two best decks. I think Dromai was the best deck. That was my view. But there were so many angles to attack both those decks. So they were so counterable. It's not like Zen was, or honestly, even Dash.io to an extent was, where it's like, okay, you fatigue it or you die. So yeah, really, really interesting. Yeah, I'll take us out. Yeah, great topic, Pankaj. I love that. I think it's such a great piece to revisit. And this is piece of Flesh and Blood that for such a long time has been something that has been discussed, but maybe not, or it's been talked about, but maybe not discussed. And I think given some some borders on what it really is and what turn cycle math is and math in the game. So I'm glad we did that. We're going to talk some Living Legend next week. We're going to do a giveaway. So that's it for episode 190 of Arsenal Pass. Look forward to seeing you all next week. And until then, we'll see you later.